The HOA built 23 luxury cabins on my private island, and the president just laughed in my face when I told her to stop, handing me a bill for trespassing before her crew bulldozed the dock my wife and I built with our own hands. I didn't oppose, scream, or call the cops right then. Instead, I let them finish construction, watching them pour every foundation and frame every wall while they thought they had me cornered because my original deed was missing. Little did they know, I was secretly building a case that would turn their multi-million-dollar project into my personal retirement plan, and if you believe no HOA bully should ever get away with stealing a family's legacy, you're going to want to stick around for the moment their entire empire crumbles. The morning this all started felt like any other Saturday on Blackwood Lake, where the mist usually hangs low over the water like a heavy blanket until the sun finally decides to burn it off around 8. I was sitting on my dock with a steaming mug of black coffee, the kind of quiet morning I'd earned after 30 years as a structural engineer for the Corps, just listening to the loons and feeling the wood grain of the planks under my boots. My wife, Sarah, and I had spent 3 summers building that dock, board by board, nail by nail, and it was the only place in the world where I felt like the noise in my head finally stopped. Then, out of nowhere, the air started to vibrate with this low, rhythmic thumping, the kind of heavy diesel growl you only hear on big construction sites. And I saw them. A convoy of trucks and a massive yellow excavator crawling over the old stone causeway that connects the mainland to my island. Now, you have to understand this ISN and oppos. Just in quote. The in quote. Island, it's my island, a jagged 6-acre piece of granite and ancient pine that my grandfather bought back in the late 40s for a couple $1,000s and a handshake. It was in my name. I paid the taxes on it every year, and it was the crown jewel of my family's history. But as I watched that lead truck, a white pickup with the in quote, Highlands Community Association in quote, logo on the door, roll right onto my shoreline, I felt this cold knot of confusion tighten in my chest. I rowed my old aluminum boat across the narrow channel, my heart hammering against my ribs, thinking maybe a driver had missed a turn or a surveyor had flipped his map upside down. But when I stepped onto the gravel path, I was met by a woman who looked like she'd been born holding a clipboard and a grudge. Her name was Meredith Vance, the kind of woman who wears crisp white linen to a construction site and speaks to you like you're a toddler who's lost his shoes, and before I could even get a word out, she was telling me to vacate the in quote, common area in quote, immediately. I told her as calmly as I could that my name was Elias Thorne and that she was standing on private property, but she just gave me this thin, shark-like smile and tapped her pen against a set of blueprints. End quote. Mr. Thorne, I think you're mistaken, end quote. She said, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary politeness that sets your teeth on edge, end quote. The Highlands HOA recently updated the community master plan, and according to the latest county filings, this island was incorporated as a Phase 4 expansion for our luxury rental project. End quote. I felt the blood drain from my face as she explained, with terrifying confidence, that they were building 23 high-end cabins right where my grandfather used to take me fishing, and when I told her I had the deed, she just shrugged and said, end quote, well, if you can find it, feel free to show it to our legal team, but until then, you're obstructing an authorized improvement project, end quote. I went home and tore my office apart, sweating and shaking as I went through every filing cabinet and every old shoebox in the attic, but the folder for the island, the one Sarah had organized so perfectly before she passed, was nowhere to be found. It was like the earth had swallowed a whole, and a week later, things went from bad to worse when a certified letter arrived from the HOA, not apologizing, but billing me $1,200 for, end quote, unauthorized personal property, end quote, on their land, referring to the Adirondack shares and the fire pit I'd had there for decades. I went back to the island the next morning to try and talk sense into them, but the sound of chainsaws was already tearing through the air, and when I saw Meredith standing near the shoreline, I practically begged her to stop, telling her that the dock they were about to destroy was a memorial to my wife. She didn't oppose, even blink, just looked at me with this patronizing pity and told the excavator operator to, end quote, clear the obstructions, end quote. And I had to stand there, helpless, as 40 years of memories were reduced to splinters and floating timber in less than 60 seconds. The rage that followed wasn't an oppose. T hot. It was ice cold and surgical, the kind of focus you get when you spent your life making sure bridges dawn and oppos. T fall down, and I realized right then that arguing with a woman like Meredith was like trying to reason with a hurricane. I spent the next month playing the part of the defeated old man, sitting on my porch and watching them through binoculars as they tore up the island, poured concrete pads, and started framing those cabins with lightning speed. They were working double shifts, racing to get the project done before the summer season, and Meredith would often stand on the far bank, looking over at my house with this triumphant glow, convinced she'd bullied me into submission. But while she was busy picking out granite countertops and designer light fixtures, I was living in the basement of the county records office, breathing in dust and old paper, looking for the one thing they'd overlooked. See, I knew how these developers worked. They cut corners, they bribe the right people, and they rely on the fact that most folks don in oppos. T have a stomach for a long fight, and I eventually found the, in quote, updated plat, in quote, their lawyer had used to get the building permits. It looked official. It had the stamps and the fancy borders, but when I cross-referenced it with the state land registry, I found a tiny, beautiful discrepancy. The HOA had filed the boundary adjustment with the county, but they'd never actually recorded the land transfer with the state central office. In the eyes of the local building inspector, they had a green light, but in the eyes of the law, they were building a $5 million project on a foundation of thin air and lies. I didn't in oppos. T stopped there, though, because I knew I needed more than just a paperwork error to win this war. I needed the physical truth of the earth itself. I reached out to an old friend named Silas, a retired surveyor who'd mapped this county before Meredith Vance was even born, and we spent a rainy Tuesday afternoon in his garage looking at his personal logbooks from 1958. Silas told me that when my grandfather bought that island, they didn't end oppos. T just used wooden stakes. They drove 3-foot iron rods into the granite bedrock at every corner, and he gave me the exact coordinates that no, in quote, updated map, in quote, could ever erase. I hired a private, high-end surveying firm, guys who used GPS tech so precise it could measure a hair on a dog's back, and I had them map the island in secret, working under the cover of a thick fog one morning while the construction crews were at breakfast. When the report came back, it was even better than I'd hoped. Every single one of those 23 cabins was sitting entirely within my property lines, and not a single one had a valid state-level environmental permit for the septic systems they were installing. I had them dead to rights, but I kept the folder tucked away in Sarah's old oak chest, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the trigger because I wanted the HOA to spend every last cent of their reserve fund before I moved. I watched them finish the roofs, install the windows, and even hang the, in quote, grand opening, in quote, banners, acting like the polite, broken neighbor whenever I saw them, even when Meredith sent me a, in quote, final warning, in quote, to stay off the causeway or face arrest. The final insult came during the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a big, flashy event where they'd invited the local press and a state representative to show off their, in quote, visionary community expansion, end quote. I stood at the back of the crowd in my old work jacket, listening to Meredith give this nauseating speech about, in quote, overcoming the resistance of progress, in quote, and, in quote, improving the value of the lake for everyone, end quote, while she glared right at me. When a reporter asked if there were any lingering property disputes, she laughed and said, and quote, we've handled the concerns of a few confused individuals, and we're confident the law is on our side, end quote. And that's when I decided I'd heard enough. I didn't end oppos, T make a scene at the ceremony. I waited until the following Monday and filed a, end quote, quiet title, end quote, action in the Superior Court, a move that essentially asks a judge to settle a land dispute once and for all. I knew the HOA's legal team would see the notice, but I also knew Meredith's ego. She'd convinced the board that I was just a, end quote, bitter recluse, end quote, with no evidence, so they didn't end oppos to even bother to show up for the hearing, thinking it was just another nuisance filing. When I stood before Judge Miller and laid out the state registry records, Silas's original logbooks, and the GPS-verified survey, the courtroom got very, very quiet, and the judge's face turned a deep shade of red as he realized the scale of the HOA's negligence. He banged his gavel so hard it sounded like a gunshot, signing a court order that confirmed my absolute, exclusive ownership of every square inch of that island and everything built upon it. The next morning, the end quote, cavalry end quote, arrived. Not the police, but the State Environmental Enforcement Division and the County Sheriff's Office, armed with orange end quote, do not occupy end quote, stickers and a pile of citations that would make a billionaire sweat. I watched from my boat as Meredith came screaming out of the model cabin, her face turning a splotchy purple as she tried to block a deputy from tagging the door, but the law doesn't and oppose. Care about your linen suit when you've built a commercial village on someone else's land. By that evening, an emergency meeting was called at the community clubhouse, and the atmosphere was like a pressure cooker ready to blow. Hundreds of residents who'd paid special assessments for this project were looking for someone to blame, and Meredith was standing at the podium, frantically trying to lie her way out of it. I walked into that meeting 10 minutes late, the room falling silent as I made my way down the aisle, and I didn't oppose. Say a word until I reached the front and dropped the court order right in front of the board treasurer. End quote. You spent $4 million of these people in oppose. Money building on my land, end quote. I said, my voice carrying to the very back of the room, end quote. And as of 10:00 in oppose clock this morning, I'm evicting the Highlands HOA from my property. End quote. The chaos that followed was pure, unadulterated cinematic gold. Meredith tried to claim the document was a forgery, but when the county records clerk I'd brought along confirmed its validity, the crowd turned on her like a pack of wolves. The fallout was spectacular. The board resigned in disgrace. The HOA was forced into a massive settlement that nearly bankrupted them, and Meredith Vance found herself facing multiple counts of fraud and embezzlement after an audit revealed she'd been taking kickbacks from the developer. As for me, I didn't oppose. Tear the cabins down. That wouldn't oppose. Have been the engineer's way. Instead, I used the court-ordered ownership to sell the cabins individually at a price that covered my legal fees 10 times over and left me with enough to retire 3 times over. I took half of that money and donated it to a foundation that builds homes for disabled veterans, because I knew that's what Sarah would have wanted, and the other half went into a trust to ensure my island stays exactly the way it is for my grandkids. The neighbors who'd once turned their backs on me eventually came around, even helping me rebuild my dock out of premium cedar, and we renamed the channel in quote, Rain's Revenge in quote, as a little inside joke that stuck. But looking back at those empty pedestals where the HOA signs used to be, I realized that some people think they can rewrite history just because they have a fancy binder and a loud voice, forgetting that the truth is usually buried much deeper in the iron and the stone. So, what do you think? Did I go too far by letting them finish the whole project before I pulled the rug out? Or was that the only way to make sure they'd never try something like this again? Should an HOA ever have the power to, end quote, update, end quote, a map without a homeowner signature? Or are these organizations just legal bullies that need to be dismantled? Drop a comment below and tell me if you've ever had to fight a, end quote, Meredith, end quote, in your own life, because I'd love to hear how you handled it. And if you enjoyed seeing a bully finally get what was coming to them, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more stories where the little guy actually wins.